Great to be here. And when I say that, it feels a bit odd saying it's great to be here because deep down you feel like, actually, I'd like to be somewhere else, not actually standing in front of everybody. But Mary had asked me some weeks ago if I would speak today, and I said yes. No clue what I was going to speak on, and I felt very much that, and because there wasn't a theme or anything, I had to just choose something myself. I felt important that, that God would just highlight something to me. And I happened to be reading about Saul, and I will come to Saul's story in a bit. But I was reading about Saul, and God just really spoke to me about his servant, Saul's servant. So I'm not going to speak on the main people, the main characters that we know a lot about in the scriptures. But I just want to talk a little bit about their servants. And I looked up the meaning of servant, and the dictionary meaning says a servanthood is a person who works in another person's house and cooks, cleans, etc. for them. It's a domestic servant, or it's a faithful, devoted, trusted servant. Or it could be they treat their mother like a servant. And I nearly took that out, but I thought, no, I'm going to keep it in, because actually the mother does serve. She serves her family, and that's really important. However, if you've got teenagers or you've had teenagers or children, sometimes you feel like this. but that's the meaning from the dictionary. And then I looked up the biblical meaning of servanthood, and it said it's the act of serving others with humility and love. It's used over 1,100 times in Scripture in various forms: service, servant, serve. Being a servant of God means dedicating one's life to serving God and following his will. A servant who pleases God serves with humility, obedience, love, putting the needs of others before their own. And it's also surrendering to God's will, and choosing to follow him is central to being a servant of God. So when I was looking at it, and I was thinking, servants, and you always think of people like, we're not all called to be Joyce Mayers, Billy Grahams, Reinhard Bonnke, T.D. Jakes, or David LaRue, for those who know him, to name a few. They have served or are serving publicly, but that is not for everyone. And sometimes we don't feel comfortable. And even if you're good at something, somehow to do it in public, it just doesn't seem for you. And you feel like, I want to serve, but I can't serve in that way. And that is fine. Because I wanted to look at servants, because we are all servants, but we serve differently. And we serve in diverse places, in our workplace, our schools, our colleges, our universities, our families, in the church. And when I looked at servants, I thought, I wanted to look at a few examples in the scripture of servants, how they reacted to things, situations that they were faced with, how they were used by the sort of the main person or the leader who everybody sees publicly. And I just wanted to have a look at the relationship, and I wanted to see what God was saying, to us as individuals, as a church, as to me, as myself personally. What is my role as a servant? What is my role? What does servanthood mean to me? And the first story I came across, as I said, was Saul, but I didn't want to use him first. I want to talk about Abraham. So Abraham, he had two servants that went with him when God asked him to go and sacrifice your son Isaac. And he said, okay, I'm going. And he took two servants. And I actually have to say this, I didn't register until I read it over this morning, but, donkeys are used ever such a lot in Scripture. And they saddled the donkey. And you'll hear it in Saul as well. They lost their donkeys in Saul. And that was the whole point of, how the story started. But he saddled the donkey, and he took his two servants with him. And he travelled. And this can be found in Genesis 22 from verse 1. And he travelled, on his journey to this place, Moriah, where God had asked him to take his son and to sacrifice. And the companions, they helped with the load. I'm sure they probably gathered everything together, the food, whatever they needed. They were there to meet their every need. That's why they were there. They helped with the load. They knew what their roles were. And that's what they were fulfilling as servants. They weren't the main characters. They weren't Abraham and Isaac, but they were just as important for what Isaac and Abraham was about to do. And it talks about after 3 days of their journey, and that's another thing, after 3 days, they were asked to wait. Abraham said, you just wait here, because God had spoken to him and said, I want you to take your son, take the wood, and go up there. And he pointed and he said, that's where I want you to go, and I want you to sacrifice your son, just to show me how faithful you are. I mean, God had a plan, and I know people, have said, I've seen it even on social media, well, what sort of God is it that asks a man to sacrifice his son? But God had a plan. He always had a plan. And basically, he just wanted Abraham to show, where does he come in the scheme of things? He'd waited a long time for his son. Finally got him, and then God was asking him to sacrifice him. That sounds crazy. But Abraham was willing to follow. He knew that God would have a plan, even if it meant killing him and bringing Isaac back to life, because there were so many promises. It couldn't be that he would be gone just like that. So after 3 days, he said to his servants, please, just stay here. God has asked me and Isaac to go on. And they did that, and they went on. And then when you read Genesis 22, then Abraham returned with Isaac to his servants, and they travelled back to Beersheba. And I just want you to think about those 2 servants. They did what they had to do. They helped in preparation, and then they waited when they were told to wait, and then they were picked up later on to carry on further. So that was Abraham's 2 servants with no names, but they were important. Saul, we can read in 1 Samuel 9. Saul, his father was Kish, and he was a very wealthy and influential man. And he was the son of so many people. I can read it, but I'm not going to. Of the tribe of Benjamin. You can read it yourself in 1 Samuel chapter 9. It was so many, but he was from the tribe of Benjamin. And Kish had a son named Saul, and it actually tells you, I don't know why it has to go into so much detail. His son was the most handsome man in Israel, that's what it says here. Head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. And if you're like me, and when you're talking to your husbands or your partners, you say, yeah, just like you. Just, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But it's, he was the most handsome man. I never quite understand why they have to say that, but there's obviously a reason, because to man's eyes, he was the best, and he was the most appropriate for the role of king, which is what the whole story surrounds. Anyway, one day, Kish, Saul's dad, loses the donkeys. This is the story of the donkey. So he loses some donkeys. And he said to Saul, I want you to take a servant and go and find them. So this is what Saul did. He took a servant to look for the donkey. So Saul took one of the servants and travelled through the hill country of Ephraim, the land of Shalisha, the Shalim area, and the entire land of Benjamin. But they couldn't find the donkeys anywhere. Finally, they entered the region of Zuph. And Saul said to his servant, let's go home. By now, my father will be more worried about us than about the donkeys. And this is where the servant steps up. It's a different level to the 2 that Abraham had. But the servant said, I've just thought of something. There is a man of God who lives here in this town. He's held in high honour all the people because of everything he says comes true. Let's go find him. Perhaps he can tell us which way to go. And then Saul says, but we don't have anything to offer him. Even our food is gone, and we don't have a thing to give this man of God. And then the servant said, I have one small silver piece. We can at least offer it to the man of God and see what happens. What I'm trying to highlight is the servant. The servant is saying these things. The servant is telling Saul, the most handsome man in Israel, that this is what we need to do. Okay? You have a place as a servant. Don't feel, just because you're not the main person, God can't speak to you. Because he does. He speaks to all of us. Okay. So, they went to see him, and they found him, and so on. And the story goes, and if you can read it yourself, 1 Samuel chapter 9 through from 1 to 26 really, read the whole thing, and it talks about how Samuel saw him coming because God had already told Samuel that Saul was on his way. Samuel saw him coming, and Samuel says, and he actually explicitly says, come up to worship with us, I'm going to sacrifice. And he says, I have a table and it's got a place for you and the servant. He actually says that, the table, and there's a place reserved for the two of them, not just for Saul, but also for the servant who has no name. You don't have to be the main man to be used by God. You need to remember that, we are all his servants, and he wants to use us all the same, but differently, if you get my meaning. So they stayed in the town, and they did all that they were going to happen. And like I said, read to verse 26. Then verse 27, it says, when they reached the edge of the town, Samuel told Saul to send his servant on ahead, because he said, I've got a message for you from the Lord. That's what Samuel said. It wasn't for the servant's ears. It was just for Saul to hear about how he was going to become king, and how he was going to win battles, and how he was going to, look after Israel. It was important that he heard the message. It wasn't for the servant's ears. When Saul and his servant arrived at Gibeah, that's 1 Samuel 10, verse 10. So all those verses before, a lot of things. Let me tell you, a lot of things happened in those verses between 1 Samuel 10, verse 1 to 1 Samuel 10, verse 10. In fact, almost to the point that those few verses were the verses where I first thought, well, is God asking me to speak on that direction? Because if you read it, there is so many things that Saul had to do, and so many people he was going to meet with, this and that, a bit of food, and there were so many things, and direction, take the left, the right turn, all that. And I thought, Lord, is that what you're telling me to speak on? But no, it was about the servant. Samuel had a message for Saul, and it wasn't for the servant's ears. The servant went on, but Saul met up with the servant later on. And I reckon it was probably a good way off, because he was a few days he had to wait. He had to wait something like 7 days, where he was before Samuel had given him the message. So Samuel's servant really was very close to his master. He was able to offer advice to his master. Part of God's plan, getting Saul to where he needed to be, to see the prophet, to have the silver, to sit at the head of the table with him. But he knew his role. He waited when Samuel asked Saul to stay for the message from the Lord, and then met him afterwards to head home. It's really important to understand what our role is. And this next person is very interesting. And I didn't know how to say his name until I realised that Aston Villa had a player that was called Gehazi. And I thought, I always used to say Gehazi, Elisha's servant, but Gehazi is how they pronounced it for this player. So I thought, that must be how you say his name. So 2 Kings 4 and 2 Kings 5, this is the other servant, the servant with a name. And he'd got a name, and it was used often in Kings, because later Elisha asked Gehazi, what can we do for the Shunammite woman? She seems to have everything. She seems to, she set a room up for Elisha every time he came. There was somewhere for him and his servant to stay. And Elisha just wanted to bless the family. Seemed to have everything. So he said to his servant, Gehazi, what can we give her? And he replies, she doesn't have a son. Her husband is an old man, and she hasn't got a child. So basically, Elisha said, do you know what? The next time we come, she will have a son. And this all happened. And she had a son, and that was great. But unfortunately, sometimes we are encouraged to step outside of our comfort zone, and we're asked to do things. And later on in that story, just thinking, have I missed the verses? Later on in that story, Gehazi ended up having to go back to the Shunammite woman because her son had passed away. He died out in the field with the father, and they brought him back into the house, and she went to find Elisha, and she said, I didn't ask for this, I didn't ask for any of this, and you've given me a son, and I am grateful, but now he has passed away. You need to come. And he sent, Elisha the prophet, sent Gehazi with his staff, which is another whole message, means so much, about a staff of a man of God. And he sent Gehazi with it, and he said, lay this on the child, lay this on the boy, and he will come to life. But he didn't. And so Elisha had to go. And I just thought, wow, I'm sure Gehazi must have thought, why is he asking me to go? I'm no prophet. It's him they want, it's not me. But he went. Nothing happened. And in a way, that could be very disheartening, because sometimes you can feel like, I've put myself on the line and nothing's happened. We've all been there. We've all done stuff. We've all stepped out, said something, and then wish we'd never said anything, because you feel like it's all come back to you and it's all been very negative. So he went, and nothing happened. So Elisha went, and the boy came back to life. But the main story that I want to look at on this one is the commander of the Aramean army, Naaman. This was an interesting one. As you read Gehazi's story through Elisha and Kings, you realise that actually Gehazi was used greatly, but he had a few things that really needed to be ironed out or sorted. And we've all got them. We've all got them. And even this week, I think to myself, I could have easily been him. Because, you say things, you do things that are not what God wants you to do. But you just do them because you just feel it's right. You need to do that. You're justified in saying what you say and doing what you do. But it's not always what God wants. So, it picks up the story, 2 Kings 5:20, where it says, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, Naaman, let me just go back. Naaman dipped 7 times into the Jordan River to be healed of his leprosy. Okay, that's how it starts. So then Gehazi said, obviously he's offering everything because he's a very rich man, he's a commander of the army, and he's offering loads of stuff to Elisha and Gehazi, and Elisha said, no, we don't want anything. This is God. God has done this. It's not for us to receive any pay. Gehazi, though the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, my master should not have let this Aramean get away without accepting any of his gifts. So there's his first problem. He's making a decision that wasn't his to make. And he said, as surely as the Lord lives, I will chase after him and get something from him. So that's exactly what he did. He chased after Naaman, and Naaman saw him, and he climbed down from his chariot, and he went to meet him, and he asked him, is everything all right? And Naaman asked, and he said, yes. And Gehazi said, but my master has sent me to tell you that 2 young prophets from the hill country of Ephraim have just arrived, and he would like so many pounds of silver, 2 sets of clothing, etc. And Naaman said, of course, take more, take twice as much. So he gives it to him. And he sends him away, and this is another interesting point, he sends him away with 2 of his own servants, Naaman does. So he sends 2 servants with the servant of Elisha to take all this stuff back that Elisha had told him not to have. He took all the clothes and the silver back, and he got to the outside of the city or the town, and then he sent the servants of Naaman back to where they came from, back to Naaman. You go back, I'll take it from here. Because he knew that he wasn't doing the right thing. And he took the gifts from the servants and sent them back. Then he went and hid the gifts inside the house. Be careful not to get confused to what God has called you to do with the calling of the one you're supporting. Because it's so easy to run ahead of ourselves and feel like, this is my role. Because it's not your role. It's not my role. It might be your role if you're the main person in something. It may well be your role. But if it's not and you're supporting, be careful not to run ahead and try and do what's not for you to do. So he lied, saying to the 2 men, they needed the items. He hid them at his home. And then Elisha actually said to him, "Where have you been?" And he says, "Well, nowhere, I've just, I'm okay, I'm fine, thank you, blah, 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 blah." And then he says, "Don't you realize that I was there in spirit when Naaman stepped down from his chariot to meet you?" And when I read that, I thought, wow, how could Gehazi get it so wrong? How could he not know that Elisha was going to know? He knows what Elisha was capable of through God. How did he not know that he was going to see what he was up to? And I thought this was a very apt word where it says, "Is this the time to receive money and clothing, olive groves and vineyards, sheep and cattle, and male and female servants? Is this the time?" So that signifies to me there are some times when you can receive gifts, but there are other times when you shouldn't. But there are other times when you shouldn't take gifts. Unless God has said, yes, don't take gifts for what he has done. So Elisha said to him, "Because you have done this, you and your descendants will suffer from Naaman's leprosy forever." What a horrible end, I think, to somebody who was a servant for such a man of God. What a horrible end, just because of his greed. And so when I looked at the three types of servants, and there are many in the scriptures, so I looked again at Abraham, the support. Can you travel with someone, help where you can, but know your limits? Know when God says step back. Can you do that? Can you step back from somebody who's probably up the front or, speaking somewhere where there's big crowds and you've been asked to sort of support? Can you step back and say, well, actually, that's not for me, that's for them? And know what God has called you to. For Saul's servant, are you able to tell the person you're supporting when you feel that maybe there is something else that can be done? Because sometimes they need to hear your voice. You're not speaking publicly with a microphone. You're actually having a one-to-one with the person that you're supporting. And you're saying, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Do you advise them to seek other advice? You might come alongside somebody who needs advice there's so many areas now these days. There's so many things that people are struggling with, anxiety, their fears, so many things. Can you say, actually, I know somebody that can really help you, or, I know an organisation that can help you. Let's not be afraid to give advice to sometimes people that you're supporting. Possibly you need to support financially. We've heard about the Southport thing this morning, and let's support if we can. Sometimes you can't, and God knows that. Please don't beat yourself up. God knows that. Sometimes you can't. But if you can, and it's what he's called you to do. I'm not saying you just go out and give willy-nilly to anybody, but what I'm saying is sometimes God lays something on your heart. Just follow through with that. Are you able to not get disappointed and bitter when the time comes for you to step back, or even to keep your thoughts to yourself? Because it's hard. I know that, because I've been there many times over the years. And it's hard not to be bitter and disappointed. Gehazi, the servant, sometimes, he was encouraged to step outside of his comfort zone. But, we need to pray about that. We need to seek God's voice on it. We need to look into his word and think, is that for me? I often do that when Mary asks me to speak. Let me tell you. I think, Lord, do I have to do it again? But, it's sometimes, we have to step outside of our comfort zone. And sometimes we don't. We step back. I think we need to be careful as well and not get confused to what God has called us to do with the calling of the one we are supporting, like Gehazi. He had that problem, didn't he? He thought he knew better. But the problem was he had to lie to get it, and that's the bit I really don't understand. You had to lie to get it, so why did you think that was going to be better? Let's be careful that we know what our calling is, not what other people's are. There is a time to accept gifts and plaudits, and then there will be a time when it is not for you. Let's not be greedy. Let's give God the glory. So, for me, this is the slide. I've got two slides, and this is one of them. You're about to see it, and you probably can't read it. Can you read it? Yeah. So I think these are the requirements of a servant. And we all know about the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Galatians 5:22-23. And so I looked at this and I thought, wow, Lord, all this is part of servanthood. So loving what you do and those that you serve. Joy, that expressed joy as you go about serving, and it's not always easy. I know that. Peace. And I love this one, knowing that you are doing what you are called to do, because there is a peace in it. Patience, not rushing into what is not for you yet. It may be, but it may not be. And it may be, but not for now. And we've got to recognise when God is saying, be patient. Don't rush into this, because sometimes there's lots of things we need to learn on the way. Kindness in your comments and your actions as you serve and those you serve with. Goodness, knowing that only good can come from what you are doing and from him who called you. Only good can come. Faithfulness, even when it is tough. Someone could be relying on you to do something. Gentleness, let's not be harsh, but be gentle, even if what you are receiving is far from that. And believe me, I know it is tough. And it's not, for me, it's not being in the church, it's being external to church. In my workplace, sometimes I've been treated harshly, and yet I've had to try my best and be as gentle as I can to these people. Self-control, when you want to take over, but it is not for you to do that. You need to hold back. So the greatest servant of all is Jesus, who the prophets foretold would come and serve humanity. He died. He rose again. He did so much while he was on this earth, and he's still working in our lives today. So I was thinking about my story in terms of servanthood, and a thing that came to mind, and I'll quickly go through this, it's not going to be long. It was a particular story when I went to Bible college. I went to Bible college in September 1980, and I went for 2 years, and I did diploma in theology, and that was all things Bible, and how to do a sermon, and how to do lots of things. And one of the jobs we all had duties, all the students had duties. One of my duties, my main duty, was to do breakfast. So I was up early in the morning in the kitchen with another student, Andrea, and we sort of laid out, got toast ready, and all that. All the cereal was out and the milk, and all the tables, we put everything on tables. That's what we had to do. That was our role. Because I did that, I didn't have to do duties in the week. I loved that part, because everybody was out, especially when it was cold, and they were out in the gardens and everything. So they were all over the place, cleaning in the gardens. They were everywhere. The students were, making sure the place was spick and span. But because I'd done breakfast duty, I didn't need to do that. So I was grateful about that. But so what I did was, there was a little chapel just across the way, and what I did, I used to go in there and I used to practice to play the piano. I used to practice songs, I used to practice choruses, lots of different things. And I used to just have a little tinkle on there, because I used to think, well, I've got nothing else to do, but I'll do this. But I really felt God was doing something with me in that time. And then I came back after 2 years at Bible college, and the pastor at the time, there was this great big grand piano, and I was like, somebody had given it to the church, and he said, Pat, would you lead worship? And I was like, are you having a laugh? I thought, I've done 2 years of tinkling on the piano and gaining a bit of confidence, and now you're asking me to lead worship. And well, Simon will know, because he was here in those days, and many others that were here, and played along, and we supported each other. But the church supported me. When I played duff notes and I sounded like Les Dawson on his Christmas special, they didn't throw carrots and tomatoes at me. They sat and they encouraged me. And I was grateful for that. I was really, really grateful. And, many times since then I have felt I've come to the end of my time with worship and leading and playing. But somehow God just keeps pulling me back. And you know what? I've never been so grateful, because it's my heart, really. It really is my heart. So what I'm trying to say to you is, you might not be the top of your game. You might not be the best at everything. However, God can use you. And I don't know whether we've got time, but my last slide, have we got time? Or maybe we can think about it. No, we don't have to have a discussion. But there's a bit of paper on your... Yeah, there's a picture. Yeah. If you want to take a picture of it and take it home, and just think about it over the next few weeks. Is there something you enjoy doing? Have you a talent or a gift that could be used in the church? Is there an area in the church that you have thought, I would love to do that, or I would like to have a go at that? What is it? And all I'm saying to you is that, not everything you write down will be considered by the church pastor and the elders and deacons. However, write it down, share it, and see where it goes. Who knows? Someone may be just waiting for you. And this is what I call servanthood.